Now, I like to think that I'm a patient person. I don't know if you can relate to that. When I'm standing at the crosswalk downtown, I will wait for the little crosswalk sign to turn so that I can walk across the street. Even if there's no cars around, I can be patient for a minute or so. What about maybe it's when I'm waiting for an important decision, right? And I've got a big purchase coming up or something huge in my life, and I can be patient for that because I don't want to make the wrong choice there, unless it's a good deal that I might miss out on. You know what I mean? Like I'll see something that's half off and I'm like, well, I don't need that, but that's a great deal. What if I don't get this chance again to purchase this at this price? I could probably use this. And then it goes unused in my house because I'm not as patient as I'd like to think that I am. Or maybe it's when I say yes to an opportunity. Someone asks me to help them with something and I too quickly jump in because I don't want to let them down. I'm a people pleaser. I don't want to disappoint somebody, and so I'll jump into a commitment without taking time to consider if it's really something I should be committing to in the first place. See, I'm not always as patient as I'd like to think that I am. I don't know if you can relate to that. A lot of times for me, I'm impulsively making decisions. They seem right in the moment, but I'm not making them because they're the right decision. I'm making them out of fear. It's fear of missing out on a good deal or a great opportunity. Fear of disappointing someone or letting them down, what they would think of me if I said no to them. See, when I don't want to be patient and take the time to think these things through, I'm impulsively making decisions, I think because patience feels like passivity to me. Like my inaction is going to take away my potential opportunities. But what I've been learning recently is that patience isn't passive, or at least it doesn't have to be. I think patience isn't about doing nothing. It's about making the choice to trust God's timing in my life rather than rushing ahead with my own timing. I mean, consider that our culture often values speed over wisdom, action over reflection. We're conditioned to expect immediate results. We have this desire for instant gratification all the time, and it's easy to associate then patience with weakness or with indecision or with passivity. But I think biblical patience, the kind that we see in the book of Esther, I think it's actually a form of courage. It's choosing to pause even when every instinct tells us to move. And when we practice patience, we're actively resisting the urge to control. Instead, we're choosing to trust that God is in control and that He is already working. It takes discipline, though, to trust that things don't have to happen on my schedule. That waiting for His timing doesn't mean that I'm going to miss out or fall behind. Patience isn't passive. It is active trust in God's timing. Now that might sound like a big, bold claim to make when I'm talking about a 50% off deal on a board game at Target, or I'm talking about helping Mark stack chairs for 15 minutes. Like I don't need to stop and pray about those things, not necessarily. But what I do want to say is that I think trusting God's timing, when practiced consistently, means that I'm going to be practicing patience in the little things too, not just the big, important life decisions, although I better be practicing patience there too. Think about those big moments when it's hard to be patient for you. Like when you're waiting for a job offer and you've gone through the interviews and you've sent your follow-up emails and now you're just waiting for the phone to ring, for the email to come through. And every day feels like an eternity as you wonder whether this opportunity is the one for you or if maybe you should start considering other options. Maybe you're waiting for healing. And you've been through the treatments and you followed the doctor's advice and you've prayed for recovery, but healing hasn't come yet. And every day feels like an uphill battle as you wonder if things are ever going to get better. Or is this something I'm going to have to live with now? Maybe you're waiting in this election season and you've watched the debates and you're about to cast your vote and you're hoping that the outcome is going to bring the changes that you believe are needed. But I think we all know deep down, even if your favorite candidate wins, the changes that you're hoping to see will not happen overnight. You're left waiting and wondering, how long is it going to take for things to get better? See, I think there's a big difference between waiting in fear and waiting in faith. Patience isn't passive. It is an active trust in God's timing. And that's where Esther's story challenges me. See, Esther is under immense pressure in this book. It seems like she's the only hope to save the Jewish people. They're going to be massacred unless the king shows mercy and gives Esther a chance to do something about Haman's decree. But if you remember from the end of chapter 4, the first thing she does when she learns about this, the trouble that the Jews are in for, when she learns about what's about to happen, the first thing she does is she asks Mordecai and the entire Jewish population to fast and pray for 3 days while she mentally and emotionally prepares herself for what she needs to do. Now, she's already decided she's going to risk her life and talk to King Xerxes. She's already resolved to do the hard thing, but her response begins with patience, not inaction. I wouldn't call it that. I would call it active trust in God's timing. Because in calling for a fast, Esther is intentionally creating space to seek God's guidance. It's an active way of inviting God into this critical moment for her and for her people. So when I'm talking about patience as active trust, this is what I mean. She isn't passively waiting. She is actively preparing herself for what's ahead. We're going to read starting in chapter 5 of the book of Esther. You can turn there now if you have your Bibles with you. I'll have it up on the screen behind me. You can read along there as well. But we'll start in verse 1 of chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, and she stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. So this, for Esther, is the moment of risk. Because what she's doing is a death sentence. You don't approach the king unsummoned. But one thing I love about the book of Esther is that it is full of dramatic irony and reversals, things that you wouldn't expect. Your expectations are totally flipped on their head. Anyone in Esther's position should expect to die in the next verse, right? You walk up to the king's hall, you're standing there waiting to talk to him, well, then you're off to your execution. That's the expectation here. Because in ancient Persia, the concept of approaching the king uninvited wasn't just a risk, it was a form of rebellion. So for Esther, who on top of this is a woman and a foreigner, two knocks against her in her culture, to step into the king's presence, even as his queen, without an invitation, was unthinkable. And yet, her choice to wait and approach at the right time, I believe, is an incredible display of both courage and wisdom, because she knows the power dynamics that are at play here. And rather than reacting impulsively, as soon as she hears about this decree, instead of running to the king and saying, no, we got to straighten this out, we're going to see Esther strategically leverage each interaction. Each moment that she has to capitalize on, she uses, I believe, strategically. And it's a reminder that patience isn't about being passive, it's about being wise, even calculated when the stakes are high like this. Esther's patience isn't blind either. It's informed and purposeful. And Xerxes ends up finding favor with her. Here's his response in verse 3. The king asked her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom, it will be given to you." So Esther's walking in, huge risk with a big request. And the king gives her a blank check. "I'll give you up to half of my kingdom," he says, which seems like the perfect opportunity to make a bold request, right? This is the moment. Here's her big blank check favor. "If it pleases the king," replies Esther, "let the king, together with Haman," that's the guy who wrote the decree that's going to annihilate the Jews, "let the two of them come today to a banquet that I've prepared for him." Come to my banquet. That's her big, bold request in front of the king. She risks her life to talk to the king, and all she asks is that he and Haman come over for dinner. Where's the urgency, Esther? People's lives are at stake here. That was your moment, and you wasted it on a dinner invite. That's what I think when I read this story. But maybe, I caution myself, maybe she's being patient so that she could get Xerxes and Haman into a room together and then see the look on Haman's face when she exposes his plan to King Xerxes. That's a pretty good plan. That'd really blow up in his face, right? But anyway, the king says, yes, right away, that sounds great. We'll come to your banquet. And he sends for Haman, and they go to the banquet. And Xerxes again offers her that same blank check in verse 6. They're eating, they're drinking, and he says to Esther, "What is your petition? It will be given to you. What's your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Okay, Esther, here's the moment. This is the one. In verse 8, "If the king regards me with favor, if it pleases the king to grant my petition, fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I'll prepare for him then. And then I will answer the king's question." Why? Why the need for a second banquet, Esther? It almost seems comical at this point. She risks her life to invite him to dinner so that she can invite him in dinner again. Like it doesn't make any sense to me. And scholars and commentaries address this with all sorts of reasons that run the gamut. But all of them have one thing in common, at least all the ones that I could find. Every one that I read points to this move as strategic, a decision that she makes not as hesitation, "I'm not ready to talk about this yet," but as a calculated move to get herself in a better position to have a better outcome, which seems crazy to me, but there's so much context here that we don't have. So whether she was waiting for some kind of sign from God, or she was setting up Haman's expectations so she could really pull out the rug from under him, I don't know, and I don't think it really matters at the end, because what I see here is that Esther has a sense that this isn't the right moment. And she trusts in that moment that a better moment would come soon. But that better moment, before we get there, we have 2 more story beats that we have to cover. And I'm going to summarize them pretty quickly. We'll pick up at chapter 5, verse 9 to see Haman as he leaves the banquet. He bumps into Mordecai and it just about ruins his night. Here's what happened. Haman leaves the banquet and he's feeling really good about himself because he was honored by being invited to this banquet with the king and the queen. And then she invites him to a second banquet. So it's like double honor. He's feeling really good about himself. And then his good day is ruined when he sees Mordecai at the king's gate on his way home. And he's reminded how much he hates Mordecai. So when he gets home, he's trying to make himself feel better. He's bragging on himself to his family and his friends. I'm so rich. I've got so many kids. The king is honoring me. I'm even being invited to back-to-back banquets. Like the king and queen love me right now. And here's verse 13. But all of this, Haman says, gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. As long as Mordecai's alive, I can't enjoy any of this. And so his friends and family, they say, Haman, why don't you just kill him? I mean, you're influential in the kingdom. Why don't you just have a giant pole set up and in the morning, just ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. And then he'll be out of the picture. You can go to your banquet and enjoy yourself and everything's gonna be great. And Haman says, that's a great idea. That's just what I'll do. So he has this big pole set up in front of his house so that he can have Mordecai impaled on it the next morning. But as that conversation is happening at Haman's, Xerxes is unable to sleep. And so he asks that the royal records be read to him. It's the chronicle of his rule and reign over the kingdom. And as those records are being read to him, he's reminded of a situation, a time back in chapter 2, when Mordecai saved his life from an assassination attempt. Verse 3, the king says, what honor and recognition was given to Mordecai for this? He saved my life. Like, what did we do for him? And the attendant said, well, nothing. Nothing's been done for this guy. And so as they're having this conversation, and the king is kind of wrestling with like, well, what should we do for this? In walks Haman to ask the king to impale Mordecai on this pole. But here's how the interaction goes. I love this. It's so good. Verse 6, when Haman entered, the king asked him, Haman, what do you think should be done for the kind of man that the king delights to honor? And Haman thinks to himself, well, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? I am living the high life. He must be talking about me. So he says, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with the royal crest placed on his head, real official looking. And then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them robe the man the king delights to honor. And then lead him on horse through the city streets, proclaiming as he goes, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Which sounds to Haman like a great plan for him. And so the king says, great. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, and do not neglect anything that you've recommended. Man, the irony is so thick, and it's such a good story. This whole chapter, which only comes about because of Esther's patience at the beginning in the last banquet, this whole chapter is just a dramatic reversal, just this thick irony. It's not just coincidence. It's a reversal not about luck or random chance. It's God's providence unfolding perfectly in his timing. That's what we see in this story here. And if Esther's patience is what orchestrated or what caused this to happen through God's orchestration behind the scenes, that's something we should take note of. I don't think patience is just about holding back, like waiting for things to happen around you. I think it's more about creating space for God's work to be revealed, for God's plan to unfold in ways that we couldn't have come up with on our own. What we're seeing here in this reversal is the fruit of Esther's active trust in God's timing. So for Haman, instead of getting rid of the guy who he feels is ruining his life, he's made to parade him around the streets proclaiming his honor. And because of that, his family and friends, they're like, well, you can't try to kill him now. The king loves him. It's going to ruin you. And they're right. But the irony doesn't stop there. Haman's name literally means celebrated one. So Haman, who once was celebrated, is forced to celebrate the one man who refused to celebrate him. He's been utterly humiliated. But before he can even sulk, the story just keeps moving. He's immediately whisked away to the second banquet that he's been invited to. And it looks a lot like the last one. They're enjoying themselves. Xerxes offers her another blank check to request almost anything she wants, and she finally takes her moment. She reveals herself as Jewish, which means that Haman conspired to kill Xerxes' queen. And so Haman is terrified, understandably. And King Xerxes is filled with rage, understandably. So Haman is begging for his life. And one of the king's servants says, hey, there's a really tall pole set up over by Haman's house. He had it set up to impale Mordecai, the guy who saved your life and you paraded around town this morning. And so Xerxes says, well, take Haman, impale him on that pole. And they did. And it happens fast. And you could almost miss it if you're not paying attention. We covered 3 chapters this morning, but the bulk of it took place in less than 24 hours. And I don't want you to miss the patience that it took to set up these events. It wasn't just about waiting for that right moment. It was about waiting in faith, trusting that God's divine guidance was orchestrating things behind the scenes to reveal that right moment. Because I'm sure Esther felt pressure to act. I would guess everything inside of her was screaming that she should stand up and expose Haman at the first chance that she got. That's how I feel when I'm impatient like that. When I hit a moment of crisis, it needs to be dealt with immediately. I need to take control and deal with it. But Esther waited. And she strategically and prayerfully waited with an entire community praying and fasting for her, expecting that God would reveal that right time to her. And so Esther finally put on that high-vis jacket that we talked about last week with Dallas. She moved from blending in to standing out, using her voice at just the right moment. Esther steps forward, but only after trusting in God's timing. So with Haman gone, it might seem like the story's over, right? Happy ending, good guys won, villain was defeated, but there's still a huge problem. The king's decree to annihilate all the Jews is still in effect, and it can't be revoked. Once the king's seal has been stamped on it, it's set in stone. It cannot be changed. So the threat to the Jewish people remains. Because I think sometimes, even after we overcome a challenge, the work isn't finished, and there's still stuff to be done. So Esther, once again, steps into a difficult situation, and alongside Mordecai, they work out a solution. They can't cancel that old decree, but they can issue a new one that gives the Jews the right to defend themselves on the day they were supposed to be annihilated. So what that means is when that day comes, the tables have totally turned. Because the Jewish people now have the upper hand. Mordecai has become so powerful in the months since those banquets that everyone with any kind of authority in the kingdom is siding with Mordecai and the Jewish people because they're afraid of him, his power, his reputation, his influence. So the day that was meant to be their downfall becomes a day of celebration for the Jewish people. And Mordecai, who was once a lowly official at the king's gate, is now elevated to a position of power and honor. He now takes Haman's place as Xerxes' right-hand man. And Scripture is full of these kinds of reversals, stories just like this. Old Testament stories like Joseph, who went from prisoner to prince. Or New Testament stories like Jesus, who went from crucifixion to resurrection. And what you would not expect to happen given the prior circumstances happens at the end of the story, and everyone's like, whoa, I did not see that coming. And these stories, I think, are reminders for us that when things seem bleak, even when it looks like a desperate situation, that God is still able to bring redemption in ways that we could not predict. And just like in those stories, Esther's story of patience hasn't just been about survival, it's been about transformation. A day that was meant to destroy the Jewish people turned into a day of their empowerment. Mordecai goes from the target of Haman's hatred to one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Haman, the man who tried to orchestrate the destruction of the Jews, meets his own destruction by the exact method he had intended for Mordecai. And all of that happens through God's divine guidance and through the wisdom and courage and patience of Esther and Mordecai. Sometimes I mistakenly think that patience is just sitting around waiting for something to happen. Like I just need to be on the sidelines and let things happen and then I'll jump in and get involved. Once things start to move, then I can participate. But I don't think that's how it works. I think God's sovereignty, his divine guidance, they don't cancel out our responsibility to be involved, to be active participants. Esther and Mordecai didn't sit back and wait passively. They took bold steps forward, trusting in God's timing. Patience is not passive. It's actively trusting in God's timing. So maybe you're in a season of waiting right now. Maybe you're waiting for a job or an answer to a prayer or clarity in a tough decision. And it's hard. I know. Because everything in us wants to act now, to take control, to make something happen. But the story of Esther shows us, I think, that trusting in God's timing is where true strength really lies. It's about letting go of our need for control and trusting that God really is in control and working even when we can't see it. So think about your life. Where are you struggling right now with patience? Is there a decision that you've been rushing to make? Something that you're pushing forward when it might be better to just slow down and take a breath. Maybe it's an opportunity that you're afraid you might miss if you don't take advantage right now. I want to challenge you to reflect. What would it look like to trust God in that situation instead of trying to force things to happen, which we might be naturally tending to do? I think the hardest part of this kind of patience is not knowing what God is doing at any given moment. Not getting to see the full picture, because just like Esther and Mordecai, we don't get to see that full picture all the time. But we can trust that there is a picture, that God is working and moving behind the scenes, orchestrating things, making things happen, just like he was in this story, in ways that we could never imagine or predict. So let's trust this week that God is working when we choose patience. Would you pray with me? Lord, I thank you so much for these opportunities that you give us on a regular basis to practice patience, really to practice trusting in you. God, I pray that you would reveal your work to each of us, that you would show us in the areas that we've felt impulsive and impatient lately, that you would show us how you have been moving. And when we can't see that you would give us the strength and the wisdom to be able to discern, this is not the time. I need to lean on you. Lord, help us when we struggle with patience. Help us to identify areas of our lives that we can practice patience more regularly. Help us to build up our trust in you so that we can handle things with wisdom and courage, and ultimately that your plans will unfold the way that they are meant to, that we won't get ourselves in the way of them, that we won't run ourselves crazy trying to fix them. God, help us. Thank you for partnering with us and allowing us to be active participants in your work here on earth. You are so good. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. So let's talk about next steps, because Capital West exists to help you take your next step with Jesus. And this week, I want to challenge each of you to identify one area of your life where you've been rushing ahead. It could be a decision that you've been trying to force, or a prayer that you've been waiting for, maybe a situation that feels stuck. And instead of pushing forward this week, I want to encourage you to actively choose patience and take some time each day to pray about that specific thing, that area of your life, whatever it is. And actively choose to seek, God, how can I be patient? Help me, give me strength and wisdom to discern what your timing is so that I can act within your will. And trust that, just like in Esther's story, God is working behind the scenes in ways that you can't see yet. Now, if you're new to this whole idea of Jesus, faith and all of this stuff, and you're not sure what this looks like for you, that's okay. If you want to have a conversation about what following Jesus looks like, if you're interested in someone who can give you this kind of patience that feels unnatural to you, I would love to have a conversation with you during this next song. I'll be in the back of the room by the double doors. And you just come talk to me, and we'll talk about what it looks like to follow Jesus and what that patience can look like in your life. But for all of us, I think another step could be, especially if you're having trouble thinking of one big thing that's making it hard to practice patience right now, maybe the step you can take this week is just to slow down in the small decisions. Like maybe it's as simple as not trying to optimize the fastest line at checkout. Or maybe it's slowing down when you start to quickly reply to a text or an email to make sure your tone is right and you're saying what you mean to say. Maybe, like me, it's taking that extra beat before you say yes to a commitment or a purchase that you probably don't need. These things might seem small, and they are in the grand scheme, but building healthy habits takes time and practice. And as you get better at the little things, the big ones will become more natural too. Maybe your next step is to set aside a day that you're going to spend more intentional time in silence and prayer. Could be 15 minutes, could be an hour or more. But I'd encourage you to try blocking out some time to sit down quietly this week without any distractions and ask God to show you where he's been asking you to be patient. And then practice patience as you wait for that answer. If you want to try a really big next step, you want to challenge yourself this week, choose one day this week to practice patience by not making any impulse decisions for a full day. And an opportunity or a commitment comes up, anything like that, write it down and wait until tomorrow before acting on it. And some of you are like, day with no decisions sounds fantastic. It probably will be, but get ready, because all those unresolved, unmade decisions carry their own weight, and it's not easy. It takes practice to be patient. Patience isn't about doing nothing. It's about trusting that God is at work even when we can't see it. And just like Esther's decision to wait, setting the stage for God's providence, your decision to wait on God's timing can open doors that you may never imagine. So this week, take time to trust him. In your waiting, in your decisions, in your service to others, know that God is working behind the scenes. because patience is not passive, it is active trust in God's timing.